So we as humans, we have a big impact on our environment, like we've heard before. So we, for example, change forests like these in Africa into roads and into farmlands, and we even are shaping our environment and the world and the landscape around us to such an extent that we now are changing our own climate. And I'm deeply concerned about this. But tonight I will not convince you, myself, or you how we should change our behavior to solve this problem, to solve climate change. I would like to do something different during this talk. I would like to take you on a journey of discovery, and by this I hope to provide some insight and show you some opportunities how we can also learn more about the problem of global change. And in society and in science, if we are confronted with big problems like global change, we like to focus on these things, the bigger things, the more obvious things. So we tend to generalize complex problems. So we can, for example, better predict what will happen if the climate is going to warm. Likely, these glaciers are going to melt. But what about living organisms? Of course, many organisms, in particular animals, can move, they can change their behavior, which is, I think, good news. Because also this gives an opportunity for them to change their behavior and maybe respond to change. So living organisms are clearly not glaciers, but it's also not so obvious how well they can actually adjust their behavior. So, and I believe that by zooming into some tiny organisms, we can actually learn a lot about whether they are really flexible in responding to changes, or that they might actually be more vulnerable than we may think. And I'm a biologist, as was already introduced, and I like to study nature, and this is my work, and it's also my passion. And I work on these guys, these birds here, and I would like to introduce to you the Pied Flycatcher. And I'm sorry to tell you, for some of you maybe, it's not these guys here. It's rather the dull brown one on the right. And that's the bird that stole my heart a bit, actually. And this is because it gives us great opportunities to study how animals are actually able to evolve, to respond to such changes. So it has provided us great opportunities. And this tiny fellow here, it migrates all the way from Africa, where this picture is taken, all the way to Europe. And this is a journey of more than 5,000 kilometers. And it only weighs 12 grams, which is less than 3 sugar cubes. And yet it makes this journey twice a year. And the reason for this journey is not because it's a gull or it's not that it likes to travel, but instead it actually makes this journey because it allows this bird to exploit the different environments in different parts of the world for its food sources at different times of the year. And as you might have guessed from the name, the Pied Flycatcher, it eats flies, indeed, but it also eats many other insects, and it has a special preference or need actually to feed caterpillars to their offspring. So these grossy things are small caterpillars that can be very abundant in forests in Europe. And these caterpillars can occur in large numbers in our temperate climate throughout Europe, but they only occur during a very short time window during the year. So only during a short peak of maybe a week or 3 or so. And this exact moment is actually the time that they should be out there feeding their chicks. So they breed in nest boxes. And if maybe you know this bird already from your own backyard, and if you would now open up the box, you probably find them feeding these caterpillars to their offspring. And at the moment that they actually finish feeding or raising their offspring, after that they will soon move back to Africa. And by this actually they can profit from this enormous food availability at the European breeding grounds, and at the same time they avoid harsh winter conditions in Europe when the insects are scarce. And Of course, you can imagine that if you have a complex life cycle like this, with being at different places, timing is quite a crucial thing. So these birds need to be careful to time the migrations in time. So timing is of crucial importance here, particularly because they should not miss this food peak. And this is exactly where a problem has occurred. So because of spring warming, climate warming at these European breeding grounds, actually these birds are confronted with a big shift. So this caterpillar peak, as I call it, is this major flush in food, has actually advanced forward by approximately 2 weeks. So that's quite a lot. So you would then think that these birds also need to change their behavior if they still want to make use and successfully feed their offspring. So for this, they can start laying eggs earlier, breed earlier, but maybe also they need to return earlier from their journeys. And this has been extensively studied in Europe over the last decades, and research has actually shown that in some areas these birds are indeed returning and breeding earlier. So that's great. But in other areas they do not. And this actually raises the question, how well are they actually able to change their complex lifestyles to such rapid changes? And I think we need to ask another question. Do they need to adapt? Because I showed you the shift in caterpillar peak, but as many, I think not everyone realizes that climate warming is often referred to as global warming. But in fact, this is a very uniform problem. A very pluriform problem. So even within Europe, the climate is warming at different rates, at different speeds, at different parts in Europe. So not all birds actually encounter the same problems. So some birds do not need to change. And we all know this because of extensive nestbox research at the breeding grounds, which makes them great to study because you can just open up the box, you can count the amount of chicks, you know how well they're growing, you can even estimate in the next year how well birds have survived, so you can see what the populations, whether they grow or whether they decline, as long as they stick to these boxes. But they only stay here for 3 to 4 months, and then they move on these journeys and go to Africa and go on migration. And compared to what we know from these breeding areas, their whereabouts in the rest of the year are largely unknown to us. And this actually has inspired my own research, because it always surprised me that with such a great study system that we actually know so little about this period. And I think it is important to do so, because it can, of course, have major impact. All these decisions that you need to make also during your migration and in Africa, it can have a big influence on whether you can arrive earlier back at your breeding grounds and whether you can match with this food peak. So that's all nice. So let's go and start studying these birds beyond their breeding grounds. But how do you do that? Because, as I showed you, this is a very tiny bird. And unfortunately, the technology does not allow us yet to put on big GPS devices and to track them throughout the year. These are half the size, these devices, of this bird. And they also do not dress up in national colors, like our football players. So you can also, when you're in Africa, not see which birds comes from where. So we need an alternative. And actually there is a solution, and that's this. This is a mini backpack. It's half a gram. And we actually were able to deploy several birds in the Netherlands in our population with these backpacks. And this collects data on light and on temperature. And the only disadvantage is that you actually have to catch the birds back in the next year, because you have to take the backpack off. So it's always extremely exciting if you are then there in spring to see who did return and who not. And this is how I look when I finally catch on back. So victory, I would say. And then you can get this backpack full of data of their backs. And from this, we can roughly estimate where they have been and where they go. And the first challenge that you actually have once they leave from their wintering grounds to go back to their breeding sites is actually that they encounter this, the Sahara Desert. So this is one of the largest deserts in the world, and it's soaring hot with little opportunities for them to feed. So how do they do this? So they first have to cross this before they can go back to their breeding grounds. And what actually these data backpacks told us is that they are doing this by a marathon flight of almost 40 to 60 hours in one go, flying non-stop during the night, during the day, during the night, during the day. And they not only do this, make this marathon flight, but they probably do this at very high altitudes. And we think probably even at several kilometers high. And the reason why I think this is that the temperature data actually show that they were flying under very cool conditions, whereas these conditions in the desert are extremely hot, whereas the temperatures very high up in the sky allow them actually to avoid this extreme climate of the desert. So this is an immense physiological capability that these birds actually have to do this. And this whole journey from Africa to the breeding grounds, they took only on average 2 weeks to finish this, more than 5,000 kilometers. And this means that they fly on average at a speed of more than 350 kilometers a day. Well, and this is really beyond what we previously thought that these birds actually could do. So they just, and this is including the stops. I'm pretty amazed by that, small, tiny one. But what we also find out is that, as you can already see here in the picture, the birds were spending mostly in a limited region. So they spent for more than 6 months at the same location near West Ivory Coast. And at these locations, actually, they really stick to one site. And these birds tend to return to the same location year after year and often to the same tree. But the conditions, however, can be quite different. So not all African sites are the same. And for example, some birds will spend their winter in this sort of habitat, and others are staying more closely to the rainforest. And even within this habitat, at the moment that they actually need to prepare these major flights back home, and they become almost twice as fat to fuel their journeys, actually also the habitat is changing quite radically. So also here, seasonality seems to be very important. But okay, amazing, this bird, what it can do. So what does this tell us about this whole issue of climate warming? Well, I think the first lesson that we can draw concerns our Dutch birds. And this is because they already are flying at such immense speeds, and they need to adjust to this caterpillar peak that has advanced by 2 weeks forward. So we believe that they cannot further speed up this migration to arrive earlier. So the alternative that they do maybe have is to leave earlier from Africa. Well, this sounds quite arbitrary maybe, but you also, as I showed you before, the seasonality there might actually be quite important. And not to make life more drastic, but the pictures I showed you in the beginning are actually coming from these regions where these birds are staying, where these forests are transformed into road and into farmlands. So yet we do not very well understand whether they indeed are able to depart earlier. And with that, actually, because they have so these tight connections between wintering and breeding locations, this problem of all the question, are birds able to respond to climate change, is actually moving from Europe to Africa. So, and as I told you in the beginning, this bird has been extensively studied throughout Europe. And within this tiny bird, there seems to be quite some variation in where birds are breeding, when they are breeding, and also these backpacks actually told us that they not all go to the same location in winter. And on top of this, these conditions can also again be quite different there. So this, I think, highlights how immensely complex this life cycle actually is. And it has also contains a very important message that probably we cannot give one single answer on whether this bird can really adapt to change, but also maybe not all of these birds need to respond to change, like the climate warming at their breeding grounds. And I think, I would kind of capture it in the phrase that there is maybe not something like a global impact of a problem like global warming. It's much more pluriform than we may think. And this in part has to do with these enormous complex lifestyles of these birds. So at the start of this talk, I told you that I will not have solution here about how we should change our behavior or how we should solve climate warming or protect our nature against our human impact. So what I did try to do during this talk is actually to take you on a journey of discovery, mostly my own journey of discovery in this ability of the small birds to respond to climate change at the breeding grounds. And you will also not hear me saying that we should not study melting glaciers, because I do think this is important. But I do think that if we also zoom in into the life of these more complex animals, we actually can learn much more about opportunities and also the constraints of these living organisms to respond to such enormous changes like global warming. And I think in comparison to what we can learn from a glacier, this sheds a very different light on the true nature of a problem like global warming. Thank you very much.